Hi everyone, my name's Haelian. I'm a content creator for Hades. I started playing the game back in December of 2018 when it first launched into early access. I've done speed runs, I've done high heat runs, I've done challenge runs, no hit runs, I've done most things that you can do in the game, I think, at this point. Anyway, I'm here to answer the most common questions that we get about Hades. I looked at Reddit, Twitch, YouTube, Discord to try to get some ideas of what the most common questions are, and plus, having been around the community for a while now, you definitely get a sense of what the most common questions are, especially from beginner players. I'm going to try to avoid as many spoilers as possible, but there might be some like teeny tiny ones throughout, just so you know. Okay, first question. What do I need to know before I start playing? Well, nothing really. I always find it's best to go into a strong game like Hades as uninformed as possible, just with a few spoilers, hints, tips, as you can, at least until you get started. If you get stuck along the way, of course you can look up that specific anecdote or piece of information that you need to move along, but I do personally think it's best to try to approach things from a blind perspective. But I do have a couple pretty good tips that, doesn't spoil the game in any such way. First off, I really don't recommend starting off with Hell mode on your first save file. Hell mode is a modifier for your save file when you first start it up. You can't turn it off or on later. Where it kind of adds an extra challenge, but only kind of. It's kind of hard to explain the whole thing. It adds an extra pack to punishment to make it simple and locks in certain ones. But if you've never played the game before, you're not really going to understand what it does and why. Honestly, you should probably avoid it. You might see it as, well, I'm pretty good at games, or I like to have an extra challenge in games, so I'm just going to turn on, hard mode. But what you need to know is that it's not really hard mode in Hades, I'd say. You can always customize your difficulty later on a normal save file, and if you really want, you can try out Hell mode later from a fresh save if you're really that interested. The other thing you might want to consider before you start playing too much is turning on God mode. Now, God mode is for players that want to try to make the game a little bit easier. You get some damage reduction for every death that you have in the game. You can turn it off and on whenever you want, so you don't have to worry too much about choosing ahead of time. It's in the settings menu, and so you can always start with it on and then be like, well, I don't really need that crutch anymore, so I can turn that off, But there's also no shame in playing with it, We all have different amounts of time we can spend playing video games, so I understand if you want to speed up the process. All right, my last big recommendation is the default controller bind for the reload button for the game is terrible. It's set to R3, so that means you have to press down on the right joystick to reload in the game. And you don't use the right joystick for anything else besides that in the game, so it doesn't really make sense to take your thumb off of the dash and the attack button in order to reload, when you can just change it to what I use, for instance, which is left trigger on the controller. I just swap the two binds between left trigger and R3 because you reload so much more often than you actually use the other bind for. All right, next question. I still haven't beaten the game after X amount of runs. Is that normal? I'll give you my vague answer first, and then I'll give you the real answer afterward because I know you're going to want it. So first off, don't worry about it. There's really not much use in comparing yourself to strangers online, especially, You just don't know all of the variables and conditions that other players were under, and so comparing your progress to theirs just doesn't really make a lot of sense. As long as you're having fun with the game, you should try at least not to let it get to you that maybe you're behind or maybe you're ahead. Like, it might be better off that it's a mystery anyway, because as soon as you start looking up stuff about a game, you're probably gonna accidentally get spoiled on certain details, Having said that, if you feel like you're progressing slower and you'd like to go a little bit faster, you could try turning on God mode, like I said. You could look up some tips and tricks videos. I have some guides to weapons, and also there's a great YouTuber named Jawless Paul that does great videos for beginners as well. I recommend checking his videos out. Him and I are long-term friends, so definitely check him out. Okay, so my real answer is that, well, to start, we don't have statistics, or at least I don't have them, that say how long it takes for the average player to win. I think the feedback I got from the community was that I see people beating the game for the first time somewhere between attempt number 20 and 50, at least within my community. If I look at like the subreddit, I feel like it goes up a little bit, maybe 40 to 60 attempts it might take to get the first win. But again, keep in mind that you don't know just everything that they do about the game, potentially. They might have looked up stuff ahead of time online. They might use God mode and you don't. They might have a friend that helped guide them through it. They might play a lot of action games already that, that some of that stuff is going to carry over, I guarantee it. You just don't really know what all the conditions were, so that's why I'm bringing it back to try not to compare yourself to others. And there's actually even other really tiny details that can matter that you might not think of, and I got a great example of one here. So my wife and I loved Animal Crossing on the Switch when it first came out, and we would play together and like swap the controller back and forth a lot. But we realized we're really bad at fishing in Animal Crossing for some reason. This, casual, lighthearted game, for some reason we just couldn't catch fish probably, 75% of the time. We only got, 1 out of 4 for all the fish, if that even. And I never really knew why. I didn't even bother to look up any information or anything. But one day I'm playing the game undocked for one reason or another, and I have the controllers plugged into the Switch now, and I realized I caught pretty much every single fish that I tried to. And it turned out that using the Joy-Cons wirelessly has that tiny little input delay that made it so catching fish was actually quite a bit harder for me. Maybe there's still a skill issue in there somewhere, but it made a big difference, honestly. And so that's just another example of a small condition that could affect you when you're playing Hades. But yeah, let me know in the comments down below how many attempts it took you to escape the underworld for the first time, because I'd love to have a bigger sample size. What is the strongest weapon and aspect in the game? Okay, so first I would say that there is no strongest weapon in the game. It's between playstyle, preference, and plus the game's really very well balanced, I'd say. But the biggest thing is here, we have to define what does strongest mean? This is actually, I know this is sort of a convoluted answer, but don't worry, I'll give you a real answer later on, of course. But you have to define what is strongest. Are you asking what deals the most damage? Are you asking what helps you survive the best? What wins most consistently? What's the fastest? What's beating the highest heat? There's just a lot of questions as to what that means, because all those different questions I just asked there have different answers. It's not one aspect over all of them, I'm afraid. It's not that simple. I would say the aspect that can deal the most damage might be Beowulf. There's just a lot of crazy stuff that can happen, but again, that's only a can. So then the question becomes even more convoluted, because you just might not get all the things that would make it do the most damage, and another aspect might have done better in that particular instance. So then you might ask, okay, what's the most consistent then, one that doesn't require you to get very lucky? And okay, we got some answers for that. I think Hestia is really strong aspect of Hestia for the rail. It's extremely consistent, but it's not new player friendly unless you rebind the reload button, maybe. I feel like a lot of new players don't really love the aspect, but they often get surprised when they see other people using it and they see how strong it is there. But yeah, here's my real answer. So I think the best aspects, at least for new players, that are most consistent with delivering, damage and other things. I think aspect of Eris for the rail is incredibly strong. You get that global damage boost from hitting the special on yourself, and it just makes everything really strong for the rest of the run. You don't really even have to worry about too much when you do one of those. The other one that I think is great for beginner players is aspect of Chiron for the bow. I just think that it's great because you don't have to deliver power shots with the attack. You can wait to get used to that. So you just gotta bonk an enemy attack, and then the special arrows will home in on the enemies for you, and you get a lot of range out of it too. So I think it's just very beginner friendly. But I do see a lot of new players gravitate toward the fist aspects, and my best guess to that is that I think the fists as a weapon might have the best, baseline balance, meaning that even without a hammer, very good hammers or very good boons, the fists deliver pretty well, I think. The baseline for the fists is pretty high compared to some other weapons where you really need specific hammers to get them to feel good. If you want more specific information on really good builds, weapons, aspects, I got some overpowered build videos, and I'll link those in the description down below. All right, who is the strongest god? Oh, geez. This one's even harder to answer than the other question, I gotta say. So each god has a purpose, or at least a niche, and there's no god that is just really bad or always the best, or always wrong, always right. That just doesn't really happen, I think, in Hades. Again, it comes back to Hades is a shockingly well-balanced game where you can really make anything work, especially at, 32 heat or less. 32 heat might say that's crazy, but trust me, it's true. You can get pretty much anything to work across any weapon or aspect. To explain that better, you have to know that certain gods pair better with certain weapons or aspects, or at least certain details to them. So for instance, we just talked about the aspect of Eris. So if you pair the Eris attack with Zeus's attack boon, that's going to work really well because the rail attacks very quickly. You get a lot of rapid attacks. So that only 10 or 15 looking damage from Zeus stacks up really quickly because of the rapid hits. Meanwhile, if you put Zeus's attack on, say, aspect of Arthur for the sword, which hits probably the slowest in the game, you're just not going to get a lot of damage out of it, Meanwhile, if you put, say, Aphrodite's attack onto Arthur, then you get a lot more bang for your buck because that increases the damage from Arthur by a percentage. And so basically, weapons that have a high base damage benefit more from the percentage-based boons, whereas weapons with low base damage that hit more rapidly benefit more from the on-hit effects like Zeus, Ares, and Dionysus. But that doesn't really answer the question, does it? So who is the strongest god? And I think the simple answer here is that you just really can't go wrong with Athena in any run. She just offers a great defense, especially the dash boon is probably the strongest single boon in the game, especially from a core boon perspective. It's just incredibly good. So the dash boon lets you deflect projectiles all over the place. It also gives you more what we call iframes. Iframes, it means invincibility frames, and it means you are briefly invincible to damage, even if you're in the attack animation, and thus you can avoid the damage altogether. So your regular dash already has some amount of iframes, but Athena's dash boon gives you even more. So it makes it much more easy to avoid attacks in the middle of them is the best way I can explain it. Most games have this in some degree or another, usually right after you get hit or something. But yeah, Hades has it in the dash. Even without the dash boon, Athena is still pretty good to have in what we call your god pool. I'll explain that a little bit later. Just because some kind of deflect at any point in a run is always going to be really helpful to avoid the witch's projectiles and other things. Why do speedrunners use heat? Okay, so when speedrunning Hades, there's a few packs of punishment that actually will make your run go faster, or at least on average go faster. The biggest one is going to be forced overtime. So forced overtime, it reads as enemies move and attack faster by 20 or 40%, but what it doesn't say is that it actually makes enemies spawn faster as well by the same percentage. So that's a kind of a big deal. You could say it might be a benefit too that the enemies follow you more quickly, but that's a little more up in the air. The next one is Extreme Measures 2, which will make the Lerny arena much smaller and concise, and hopefully will group the heads up a lot more in the middle of that fight. It just makes things much more susceptible to AoE damage that you might have. You might see speedrunners use tight deadline, you might not, depending on the type of run that they're doing. If they're going by the in-game timer, which is probably what most runners use, they will not be using tight deadline. And the reason for that is that if you have tight deadline on, you cannot see what we call survival rooms. So you want to have it off, just to be clear. Survival rooms are those encounters where Hades tells you to survive for like 45 seconds, I think. And during that time, the in-game timer is actually paused. So of course, any encounter where the in-game timer is paused, you want to get in a speedrun, Speaking of which, Thanatos also pauses the in-game timer, so ideally in a speedrun you would also see Thanatos. What should I spend my Titan blood on first? You earn Titan's blood by defeating bosses with different weapons at different heat. You can also get it from the Fated List and from the broker and stuff. And you use the Titan's blood to level up weapon aspects. So you can't refund Titan's blood, which is why it's probably scary for new players to decide where to spend it first. But just bear in mind that it's not that crazy to get it back. It might feel like you wasted it if you put it in a weapon aspect you end up not using a lot or not liking. But you'll eventually get it back. But having said that, I think it's probably a safe bet to say if you find a weapon you really like and gravitate toward, just throw the Titan's blood into the Zagreus aspect of that particular weapon, because the Zagreus aspects are just really, really cheap to max level out, whereas the rest are actually very expensive. They're either 15 or 16 Titan's blood to fully max out. The Wikipedia actually has a list of how much Titan's blood it costs to max out all the different aspects. So some aspects just really don't feel good until they're fully leveled, I think. I think the biggest culprit here is probably Aspect of Guan Yu. feels really bad to take at level 1 or anything below the max level, honestly. So sometimes you kind of just, you're only investing to get to that max level, and if you can't get there, it might not be worth doing the aspect too much, but if you just want to try it out, you know, you're welcome to. My favorite aspects, or weapon maybe, would probably have to do with the bow. I just think all 4 aspects for the bow are really diverse. They all play very differently, and they're all pretty strong. I think they're all very, very good aspects, and I just like the different styles of gameplay you get from each of them. Oh, and real quick, be careful when you use the broker, because don't go crazy and just exchange everything for Titan's Blood right away without knowing what the other resources do. Just give it a little bit of time and get a feel for what you can spare and what you can't before you go too crazy, I think. I loved Hades. Will I love other roguelikes too? What should I play next? Great question. So I would say that if you really loved Hades, don't go looking for other roguelikes yet if you have not played Supergiant Games' other previous titles first, namely Bastion and Transistor. You will actually get the best experience from trying those ones out, I think, because they are probably the most similar to Hades, even though they're not roguelikes. You will actually feel like you're playing just, you know, maybe not a different version of Hades, but you're playing a game that definitely influenced Hades. They're also just masterpiece games on their own, honestly. I just love the art, the music, and story. Transistor is probably my favorite game of all time, to be honest. So if you haven't played it, you really got to check it out. If you've already played those, or you're just really dead set on playing another roguelike, you might not want to look directly at the most popular roguelikes. I think, you know, the top ones might be Dead Cells, Risk of Rain 2, Binding of Isaac. Those games really don't have anything in common with Hades, other than that little subgenre tag, probably. They're great games in their own right, but I just wouldn't really, I'd hesitate to recommend them quickly, because I just don't feel like any of those 3, at least, play similar to Hades at all. The other thing is that none of those games really have a very powerfully driven narrative. You know, there's no really in-depth story going on there, and if that was one of the main appeals for you for Hades, you're probably not going to find it in most roguelikes, honestly. But here's a nice little hidden gem for you if you're interested. Going Under, it's a fast-paced action roguelike. It has a great story, a great sense of humor. The combat, you know, it feels a little bit similar to Hades, probably. You pick up objects around the room, and you use those as weapons in sort of an office setting, I guess you could say, to defeat the enemies. It's a great little game. How do I beat 32 Heat? Okay, this is a big one, but I'll try to make it quick. The first thing to know is that all heat is not created equal at all. Even though some things might have the same heat cost or value, they're probably not equated to feeling the same in the run. So there are a few things you definitely should steer away from, I think, at least for your first 32 heat win, and those are Calisthenics program, don't take any of that. Do not take extreme measures 4. No routine inspection, take 0 of that, and do not take the second approval process. If you want more information or detail about the packs of punishment, why to take some and why not to take others, I'll have a link in the description here to a heat guide that I have here on YouTube. So here's a pretty standard setup that I think most builds could get by with. Notice that we're only at 30 heat, but the last 2 heat you could throw in a few different places depending on what weapon and aspect you're running there. You could do damage control if you have a fast-hitting weapon and you're going to try to get you know, some on-hit effects like Zeus on it. You could put it into the second tight deadline if you're comfortable with that. I know a lot of players really don't like tight deadline, especially when they're starting out. Once you get to like the 32 heat levels, I think it's about the time that you're probably going to have to get used to it, honestly. A 7-minute tight deadline, it's not as challenging as it may seem, and honestly, I believe in you. I think that you can do it. How do I make a build? I thought the game was random. So there's actually quite a bit of nuance to it, I think. I think the big thing to know is that the god keepsakes from the keepsake cabinet are actually really powerful. They're overpowered in a sense to let you guarantee the next god that you see. Utilizing the god keepsakes, you can kind of control, maybe even borderline guarantee getting specific duo boons, maybe legendaries, but not as much. But the duo boons especially, you can center most builds around 1 or 2 particular duo boons, and if you use the god keepsakes, it's probably going to happen, honestly, as long as you use your rerolls wisely. You should probably know about god pools, as we call it. So in Hades, once you pick up 4 different gods as boons, that is what we call your god pool. You will not see any more new gods after that 4th. Now, there's some circumstances where you might get a 5th. For instance, if you pick up your 4th new god in a shop, and then the door, the exit door to the shop is also a new god. Boom, you got 5 gods in the pool, and you'll still see any of those 5 gods throughout the run after that. You can also put on a god keepsake afterwards to force even like 6th or 7th god too if you wanted. So yeah, I'd recommend looking at the codex maybe ahead of time before you start a run, kind of thinking about how you want to do it. If you're going to use a weapon aspect that is kind of centered around casts like Poseidon Sword or Achilles Spear or Hera on the bow, maybe look at specific dual boons that might help you, like Mirage Shot, Crystal Clarity, Hunting Blades. You know, those are some great examples. And then just trying to use the god keepsakes to force those particular things. And if you feel like the run's not off to a great start, you can always, you know, reset the run. You cannot use the give up button, by the way, because that saves the seed, as we call it. I won't get into that in this video, but you would have to throw a death out there, basically. Lastly, when it comes to using Fated Persuasion, first of all, I'd always recommend using Fated Persuasion from the mirror. It's just much more powerful than Fated Authority. Lets you re-roll the boons that you see in front of your screen. Generally, you just almost never want to use more than 1 reroll at once on a god, because it goes from costing 1 persuasion to 2 right afterwards, and it's just too costly. Just know that you're probably going to see that god again in the future. It might mean you might not get you know, the dual boons you're looking for till like the end of Elysium or something like that, but sometimes that's just how the dice roll. How do I romance this or that character? I see a lot of people asking about how to advance their relationships with the characters in Hades, and all you really need to know is to talk to every single character in between every single run. Characters will have an exclamation point over their head if they have new dialogue for you, so make sure you do that. Also, if you want to center on one particular character, save your nectar for that particular one and just keep gifting it to them. Now, you might not get things to happen as quickly as you might think because Hades has a lot of different possible events throughout the game, and so there might be different priorities going on there. So, you know, you might not be able to see one event until several other events happen, basically. So you might have to just kind of wait it out. If you really want to force through it quickly and you have, you know, nectar and ambrosia to spend, you can actually just take some deaths right away when you start a run and just farm the dialogue over and over with the characters and just advance relationships really, really quickly if you wanted to. All right, thanks so much for watching. Remember to subscribe if you want more Hades content from me. And if there's any questions I didn't answer in the video here, make sure you ask in the comments down below and I'll do my best to check them out. All right, bye-bye, everyone.